I'm thinking the same thing.
Got it.
No, that worked out pretty easily, Janet. Actually, I found some settings where you just tell it to record automatically when you start, and so it does.
Yeah, good, because Elizabeth kept forgetting, and then it mattered a lot more in that class, actually. And then once she figured it out, it was like, oh, phew.
Yeah, this makes it easy. Don't have to worry. It does mean the world hears the chit chat before class.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know.
I did hear from Nina that she's traveling. Well, would you, I have this stuff. I have some stuff I found from Marilyn McAdams, and I also found a brief little thing, talks a little bit about Fred Sontag. Would you like to do sort of some new stuff like that first, or would you like to talk about the other, do kind of the review stuff first?
I vote for new.
Yeah, new at the beginning, yeah.
Okay, so the first thing then is, yeah, just it's a professor I found who is recording a video for his class, and he's talking about a new book he wrote, but he happens to have been inspired a little bit by reading Fred Sontag, and so I just thought it was kind of fun to hear that. It's sort of, it seems like Fred was he died just before the world was really discovering how easy it was to make videos, and so I find videos of these other people. I'm having a hard time finding them of him. Anyway, so let's just start with that. This is just, it's not a lot of information, but it gives you a little flavor kind of what Fred was up to. Remember, he was my dissertation advisor, but he came into the project kind of late, so I never it wasn't important, and I wasn't inspired to really read his work because I was too focused on what I was doing with my own work. But I think it turns out he's kind of an interesting guy, and I missed out by not paying more attention to him when I could have.
Here in seminary, when I read a book that I still own and that I quote in The Story of God, maybe only one time, I'm not sure.
That's the book. Yeah.
What Can God Do? ? By a man named Frederick Sontag. There he is right there. Frederick Sontag has passed away. This book was published, 1979. That was the year I met my wife. And 2 years later, I graduated from seminary. So I guess I bought this book and read it very shortly after it was published. I was probably aware already of the name of Frederick Sontag. I'm not deeply immersed in his work, but I can tell you that, well, as it says in the back here, no, it doesn't say it there, maybe here, did his PhD at Yale, special training in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, existentialism, philosophical theology, and philosophical psychology. Sontag taught for decades at Pomona College, up just north of us, and east of LA. Part of the Claremont colleges up there, very fine school. He taught there for decades. He taught there into his 80s. Indeed, he didn't retire till he was somewhere in his 80s, as I recall. So let's say 84, 85 years old. My goodness. So he retires, and then several months later, he died. Short retirement, my friends. I'm not planning on the same thing. I'm not going to go that long. But this book, What Can God Do? It really piqued my interest back in seminary when I bought it and read it. They're short chapters, and it's got two main parts. The first part is called God Is, And the second main section part is called God is not. And so the first half is like God is, chapter 1, able to suffer, able to love, able to be free, etc. Then in the second part, God is not. And just so you can know some of the chapters, God is not able to become nothing. God is not able to reject anything. I'm going to have to reread this book and find out. God is not able to control those who represent him. God is not able to exclude desire, not able to avoid evil. The last chapter, well, God is not able to predict the future. I think that might be the chapter I quote from in the story of God. And then the last chapter is called God is not able to be very religious. And that gives you a little clue, perhaps, that while not a book written with tongue in cheek by any means, that meaning sort of sarcastically, he definitely, Sontag, employed a light touch in this book. There's a lot of humor, some of it subtle, some of it, theological humor. Only some of us can appreciate that. No, well, we all can.
What do you mean?
But I
inside
remember
jokes?
thinking, this is kind of an interesting read. The chapters are short. He's speculative at times. He says some things that one might go, about. But it sort of captured my imagination, this little book, What Can God Do? I actually have several other books by Frederick Sontag on my shelf. The only other one I know that I've read, he became quite an expert on the Unification Church, which you may or may not have heard of. It's kind of dwindled now, but in the 70s, it was a very big thing. The founder was a Korean preacher by the name of Sun Myung Moon. So this book is called Sun Myung Moon and the Unification Church. I did read that one, I think, while I was a pastor. I don't know why, fresh out of seminary. This I read in seminary. Well, so that's sort of at the background. Then I become a pastor. You can.
So just sort of a sense of it. It's interesting, and that, like the Unification Church thing, I just learned that myself a couple of weeks ago when I was doing a little more research. Like, what do you know? Interesting guy. And of course, the Unification Church has been more in the news lately because it was an anger about the Unification Church that was behind the assassination of Abe in Japan. So that's a curious thing. I'd like to talk to him about that. Anyway, so what I think you should have picked up out of that, right, is that Sontag's very into it on the side of this open relational thing that the process people are doing. So he's developing ideas about a God who's not omnipotent, but trying to talk about what other things are going to be important even if omnipotence isn't the thing that's important. Okay, so with Adams, McCord Adams, I'm finding her a little bit puzzling, and I think I said this sort of in the notes, that part of it is I think she's coming at philosophy from a little bit of a postmodern perspective, so she's not holding as rigidly to some of the categories that other approaches in philosophy would. And her expertise is actually in medieval philosophy. So she talks about that and she thinks about things through that kind of lens. And since the medievals didn't have a fully fleshed out understanding of infinity, they really didn't have a concept of omnipotence. They just had the idea of God being powerful. So there's in there a sense of an intrinsic sense of limit if you don't have infinity in the sense of power, and if you have any sense of limit, the question is going to be how much of a limit is there. So she seems to be sort of operating in a space that's comfortable with the way the process people talk, but is not herself coming from that perspective. She, by the way, she became, well, she did a PhD in philosophy and she became a professor, and then eventually was the chair of the philosophy department at UCLA, which is why all the guys we're reading from Claremont would know her, as they're all in Southern California hanging out together. And then it was after she became chair, she went back to the seminary and did her master's in divinity to become ordained. And so she was an ordained priest in the Episcopal Church. Episcopal Church is the American name for the Anglican Church, which is the worldwide body of the Church of England. And they use the title priest still. Have accepted women as priests for a while, but she was pretty early on in that. And she had some important roles. She went to Oxford for a little while to teach and was a deacon at the church that was associated with the seminary that's at Oxford. So she's quite accomplished. I didn't personally encounter her until the book came. This edition of the book came out with her. So she might have retired maybe by the time I was down there. Anyway, so I have a couple of, actually 3 short videos with her that are she's talking about different details that we've talked about so far. Anyway, we'll see what you make of it.
So I think it's very instructive as we study the historical theology and contemporary theology to see how theology has framed the relation between God and evil, the problems about God and that come up between God and evil in a different way from the way the philosophical discussion has gone. In theology, it's more or less assumed that God is within God's rights as creator to make the world as God wishes. And soteriology really deals with the problem.
Actually, that's a point that's sort of worth noting. It's something that comes out of her kind of being situated in medieval philosophy. It's, the medievals are very much living in this hierarchy of feudalism, and their understanding is very much a command system because the king is on top telling people what to do. And so they imagine God as sort of the ultimate king. And one thing they've noticed along the way is kings aren't always the best stewards of what's going on from the perspective of the rest of the people in the country. So as ultimate king, God, they wouldn't understand, they understood God to not have an intrinsic obligation to humanity, which is not something that gets sort of said directly, but it's implied in the way that a lot of theologians think, that there's the reason they're doing what they're doing is because God has a relationship. Now, they're going to emphasize much more sort of the intention in that, like sort of God wants to create creatures that are ultimately, think about Irenaeus, ultimately going to be sort of godlike in some way. He has in mind sort of full self-consciousness. It's probably what's going on there. But that, even though the emphasis is on sort of the God choosing that to pursue that relationship with humanity, everyone seems to along the way, when you're going to ask the problem of evil, you've assumed there's something that is involving God in humanity together somehow, and that God ought to be doing something or another. And the medievals are really clear that they don't have a sense of God having any kind of ought tos. There's no obligation there. And so that feels a little bit more like Roth to me in some ways, which is where I get the postmodern thinking from. But if in her case, it's very much a medieval perspective that God doesn't have obligations to us. We have obligations to God. Now, why that would be true is a little convoluted, but okay, they were medieval.
Of how God can accomplish God's purposes in creation, despite the fact that evils have occurred. And of course, traditionally, soteriology is focused on the problem that sin causes, the obstacle that sin brings up for the purposes that God is seeking. But I think one thing that we can learn from that way of framing the question is this: soteriology isn't asking, why did God permit evils in the first place? It's asking, how can God bring about God's purposes, bring them to make a success of God's project, despite the fact that evils are occurring? What is
Soteriology is about salvation.
God going to do about it now that it's all that the worst, now that the worst has already happened? What is God going to do to make good on that project? And I think that that's a really helpful framing, because when we look at the worst evils, the ones that are prima facie life ruinous, and say, well, why would God permit that? Most answers that we can think of make the problem worse. You think, oh, well, if God is the kind of person who would permit that to get an excellent cosmic excellence, you think, well, then God doesn't really care about us, does God? And so forth, right? So basically, it's best to think about, well, how can God make good on this, and how can God be good to the persons, despite what has occurred? And then I think that one thing that tradition.
Okay, so despite what occurred, very much language it's giving away, this is not an omnipotent God that she's talking about. So, which fits with that medieval view.
Traditional theology is really good on, which contemporary analytic philosophy and theology has not been so quick to take in, is what I often call the bigness of the goodness of God. The idea that God is infinite being. We say that God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived with Anselm, but we don't really take in what that means. And I think that the medieval philosophical theologians really did have a vivid appreciation of the size gap between God and creatures. And one of the important features of this is that it allows them to appreciate how the good that God is, never mind what God does, it's the good that God is infinitely more than we can ask or imagine, and how appropriate relation to that goodness might actually be something that could meet meet and defeat the horrendous evils that so many people experience, right? And so I think that trying to live into and
Could
get
you stop it a minute?
Mhm.
Did I understand her correctly that she said God is, the fact that God is and not what he does is more important?
Mm-hmm. And
Oh
then she-
God, I just don't need any more reasons to be upset with religion. I just wanted to be sure that's what I heard.
So, and then she said, God is love. Okay, so the idea that she's working with is that God, it's not, God can be comforting to people, not because there is an obligation that God has to try to be comforting the way a parent would have an obligation to be comforting to a child, but because God is goodness writ large. Think sort of about a Platonic form of goodness, that kind of idea. If God is that or love, but what you get then is that God's going to be comforting to people out of that love or out of care, but not out of obligation. And there's an important wrinkle in there that's going to navigate the problem of evil. But that's where this idea is turning. Is this is about God is love, therefore God will do this, not because God is obligated to us to do it.
What the phrase infinite being really amounts to is really important for appreciating a Christian solution to the problem of evil. And then the third thing that I find very important from the point of view of Christian theology is the notion of incarnation. Job's God is infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. And Job, at the end of the story, gets to see God, which very few people in the Hebrew Bible do. And so that makes the trip worthwhile for him, right? But the Christian God goes further. The Christian God doesn't ask more of human beings than God asks of God's self. The Christian God becomes a human being and not only is able to know what it's like for us within the infinite capacity of the divine consciousness, but to know what it's like within the finite frame of God's own human consciousness, and to what it's like to suffer and prima facie life ruinous evils within the frame of a human life, and that solidarity of God with us is something that helps to weave up our own experiences of the worst evils into our relationship with God, which on the whole and in the end could have a happy ending in the life to come. So I think that those resources of Christian theology are ones that analytic theology would do well to bring into the discussion in a lively way.
Right, and then in the book, that's Davis, is the analytic philosopher that's in question. Let's see, how am I going to do that?
Classical appeals to free will to solve the problem of how the existence of God is compatible with the evils of our experience are epitomized in the story of Adam's fall. You remember, God creates the world free from actual evil, a very good world. And God creates Adam and Eve with excellent agencies and a wonderful environment where nothing is needed and there's much to enjoy. And it would have kept on being that way, except that they sinned. And then they and their descendants have to live in the world as we know it. Classical free will approaches appeal to the concept of free will, created free will to explain the origin of evil. Now, in doing this, they're drawing on some central tenets of Christian doctrine, that God is personal, that being personal is an important aspect of the way humans image God, that personality essentially involves some sort of distinctive type of self-determination, and that wholesome relations with self-determining creatures are central to God's plans. The strategy of classical free will appeals is to shift responsibility for evil off divine shoulders onto human shoulders by appealing to the idea that between what God did, create an evil free world with free creatures in it, and evil, there comes an intervening agent, Adam and Eve, our primitive, primordial primate ancestors, who are responsible for the introduction of actual evil into the world. Now, this strategy depends on the assumption that created free agency is robust enough to shoulder that responsibility, to stand in between God and the consequences of God's actions. And I think that this appeal fails for several reasons. The first is what I like.
Okay, this is I hadn't heard anyone come at it quite the way she's about to. So it's a little subtle, but it's kind of, I think, a little clever argument she's going to make here.
To call the size gap. God is very, very big, and we are very, very small. God's personal capacities far outstrip human personal capacities. Now, usually, even where a child's initiative is the proximate cause of some bad result, the adults in the neighborhood who are supposed to be in charge of things are the ones who turn out to be primarily responsible because their agency is so much more robust. And so also, and all the more so, with us and God. God is the one who, God is the adult who is in charge of the world, and furthermore, God is the one who set us up in the world, according to the traditional story, in such a way that if Adam and Eve did not sin, everyone would continue to enjoy Eden. But if Adam and Eve did sin, Adam and Eve and all their descendants would live in the world full of the evils that we experience here and now. So God is the one who set it up. And so between what Adam and Eve did, disobey God, and the consequences of their action, the horrendous evils that we experience, there is an intervening agent who stands in between, namely God, God's own self. Their second major problem with this attempt to...
Okay, now, so what it's argument by analogy. Human beings love analogies, it turns out. So the best philosophical arguments tend up being the best analogies that someone comes up with. What's interesting there, and it's straightforward enough. I just hadn't anyone pointed out quite this way, but it's this parent thing. What's disruptive is I was just showing you a video where she was rejecting the idea that God has obligations, and now she's invoking an analogy in which God is the parent. I don't know what to do with that. So I mean, and true to form for postmodern thinkers, they don't necessarily mind contradicting themselves. So in one context, she has this way of thinking, in another context, she has this way of thinking, and okay, well, that's just the way it is. So I don't know quite how to resolve that, or if she does in the end, or if she did try to resolve it. She's passed away now to herself, so we can't ask her. But anyway, it's an interesting idea. Just contradictory with what you were just saying, but I don't know. But she has a couple more runs at this too.
Shift responsibility off divine shoulders onto human shoulders is that human beings lack the relevant knowledge. Ignorance diminishes responsibility. But where pain and suffering are concerned, we cannot fully realize how bad they are or what it is that is so bad about them without experiencing or being able imaginatively to represent what they're like to ourselves. Like a blind person may have all kinds of knowledge of color facts, but they're missing out the most important thing about colors because they can't see or imaginatively represent them. And it's the same with the worst kinds of evils that we experience. But in Eden, there were no evils. And so Adam and Eve, according to the traditional story, did not have the relevant experience that would have given them the kind of full-bodied knowledge that would have enabled them to be fully responsible for what they did. And so my conclusion is that classical appeals to free will to solve the problem of evil are not successful without further supplementation, because human agents, even if they are free, are not robust enough to stand in between God and the consequences of God's creative choice.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of way of thinking about that. And this is actually vitally important sort of principle that we use all the time in ethics. That the more power something has in a situation, the more there's an obligation there, and it even applies to traffic laws. You know, that the bigger the vehicle, the more responsibility it has if there's an accident. Which is, so if a pedestrian gets hit, it's always the car that's wrong because the car is bigger. And so anyway, so we use this principle in ethics all the time. You know, it's interesting to see it sort of applied this way. Wait. Is that the same one? No.
But they don't address, or she didn't address, if God created the world and it was good, how could evil come into something that was good?
Well,
people were good, Adam and Eve were good, the planet was good, everything he created was good.
Yeah.
According to the Bible.
Yeah. But it's the child's version of good and of goodness, because there's no challenge to the good. So in order for it to be a more robust experience, there needs to be more to it, to sort of why we have to grow up and be adults and sort of face that we understand good and evil and that we're responsible for our own behavior. But it's, so there are also, it's, keep in mind too, that the Jewish reading of it is different than the Christian reading of it. So there are other ways of kind of coming at that thing, at that problem. But I think the primary issue might be to think of it that unless you bring in that infinite concept, anything that you defined as good isn't infinitely good. It's just always going to be relatively good. So,
Well, but I thought it said, and God said it was good.
mhm.
So you would think of it as the infinite goodness. If
Well, but
he
you have
said
to-
it.
but you have to have the concept of infinite for that to make any sense.
Oh, oh,
Right. And it's not really until we get the mathematics, we start getting, it's like calculus. You have to have that at least something that's as sophisticated as calculus before math is working with the concept of infinity. And until mathematics starts working with it, you're not going to get anybody else in society really doing anything with it. So it really does take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for God says it's good, until someone will come along and say, oh, but if it's good, then it must be all good, totally good, infinite. So
okay.
if you're working with a much more ancient concept, it's sort of like saying, well, the tree is good. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean the tree's not going to die eventually.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah.
Mhm. Janet?
Yeah, also in answer to that, I mean, now the answer to that question was kind of how I interpreted what Griffin said, which is how I think you paraphrased it. I mean, was it created out of nothing, or was it created out of chaos? And if it was created out of chaos, then there's all this other stuff going on. So it was very good, but it might not have been infinitely good. Is that kind of what Griffin was saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
and you're right to pick that out. That is exactly his version of what I just said. Yeah.
Okay, all right, but you said it so much better. I mean, then we
Well-
wouldn't have had to read that chapter.
Well,
All right.
his was technically important for reasons to do with a bigger argument he's making, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I think all this discussion about it goes really back to this whole creation idea, and I think what I get hung up on is that it discusses still an idea that is basically the fundament of understanding of people who didn't have a real knowledge of cosmology and so on. I'm sorry that I'm always coming back to that, but here we talk about 7 days and God creates something, and the paradise, it was good, and then this evil aspect came about. But if we step back from that and say, well, why is there something rather than nothing in the universe as a whole? And then we think, okay, now, was there ever a state of, just like Griffin says, what was the original state that something came out of? We really need to not think of it in human terms, because with the beginning of something came concepts of time, causality, things coming and going. And so that expresses itself in the reality that we experience in loss, in death, and if you want, suffering. It wasn't maybe realized that way by very early life, but we have the consciousness to be able to suffer. But was there ever a state in which, in the creation of the universe, that was not the case, unless you say, okay, in the early cells, whatever existed in the primordial oceans, they weren't able to experience suffering and evil, so that was good. But that makes no sense, really, truly. So I think we spend so much time with some of these theorists really talking about, in a time concept, when did evil come into being? I think unless we address that, we can't even talk about why. So anyway, that's my stumbling block, and Griffin, I think, comes the closest in saying, well, there wasn't this beginning that we usually think about, you know, and talking about chaos and whatever. I'm not sure I understand it all.
Right. Well, he would. I mean, he's going to be operating with a standard version of kind of Big Bang theory. So when he talks about chaos before, he's thinking of, you know, Big Bang theory talks about there is this infinitesimal little point that's just all the matter of energy in the universe, all in this one sort of chaotic mess of near infinite density that explodes. So that's the chaos he's talking about, and so he can refer to modern physics to describe that.
Yes, and that's what I think is important to think, like, at what point did evil enter in this new version of thinking about creation?
Well, we do, you know, it's that, and that's kind of a curious question. These people are all modern, so they would want to answer that kind of in an evolutionary way. But we also know a little bit more than they did when they were writing this stuff about early. I think the anthropologists do have started being comfortable with the word humans, that, you know, that there are these early humans. So we know that Homo erectus figured out how to make fire. And we know that, you know, if you go a little bit farther, that some of the ones that are a little closer to us, like the Denisovans, the little people in the East, and maybe Neanderthal, and then one of the other ones that was sort of overlapping with us 50,000-60,000 years ago, that they start having these rituals about death. So, I mean, there's a point. So there's a story to tell about early human beings learning about the world and sort of consequences, and we start seeing them doing stuff that's in response to that, sort of having ceremonies around death, taking care of their dead, burying them, those kinds of things. But conceptually, you would think this is a problem that actually that goes back a lot farther than we could probably measure, that's maybe something anthropologists can measure. But what might it just be something that comes with every complex consciousness? And so, you know, what kind of system of right and wrong might dolphin worlds contain that we haven't figured out how to understand yet? It might be that chimps are not quite sophisticated enough. I mean, they have codes of honor within themselves, within troops, but it's not clear that they have a sense of that's a universal thing that chimpanzees writ large are obligated, that we think of human beings writ large are obligated by ethics. So anyway, so I you know, they're at one level, when you get to liberal religion, liberal theologians, sometimes you can ask the question and they can reply like this: well, you know, I think that's an anthropologist's question, not a theologian's question. When did people start doing that? And then they'll work out the theological symbols to appropriately accommodate whatever that anthropologist is telling them. But because they're going to do it with the symbols of the tradition, it almost doesn't matter what the anthropologist tells them. They'll deal with anything. The same way they can deal with sort of cosmology updates to the Big Bang theory. Those are not vital to how they understand the world. So any way science wants to spin it, they'll be perfectly comfortable reworking things to accommodate new scientific information. But those are really interesting thoughts. Yeah. Okay, so I think, let's see. She's I think going to talk about some of this stuff again, but this is, I think it was still worth seeing. Oh, Janet, you had a hand up again?
Yeah, just quick question before we start this. So if, so she was making the point that the God is this infinite good, so good we can't even comprehend it. And that's, am I correct then that that's the opposite of what Griffin was saying? That there's it's not this infinite good.
It's a different vocabulary.
Okay, back to that. A language game.
Yeah. Yeah, so you get the same kind of thinking in the way that Process would talk about God's omniscience.
Okay,
God's there with everyone, and then any of you would say, well, why would God be there paying attention? Well, it's because God is loving. So they just sort of have assumed it. They may not talk about it as much, but it's there implicitly in their
okay,
understanding.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, so she's very much comfortable with the Process view.
Okay,
I think she wants a stronger God than they have, but because she's coming at this from a non-omnipotent perspective, she's already in a conversational space with them.
okay,
Well, I would identify three mistakes. The first is that many analytic theological approaches take a global approach. They take a page from Leibniz and conceive of God's activity in terms of actualizing or making a world.
No, so remember Leibniz, philosopher, mathematician, 1800s, Germany, late 1700s. He's the one who said this is the best of all possible worlds. That's sort of his response to the problem of evil. And in that language possible, you can see how some of the thinkers in the book have moved in different directions with, okay, what is possible? Uh-oh, sorry, wrong button.
And then they infer that the goodness of God is to be measured in terms of the goodness of the world that God has made. And so they focus on how one could argue that the evils of the amounts and kinds and distributions that we find in this world could be compatible with an excellent world maker. So we find Leibniz arguing that this is the best of all possible worlds, or Alvin Plantinga saying that God has made a very good world, or an L or above world, where L is some high level of excellence. And
Alvin Plantinga, very influential late 20th century analytic philosopher, and that L level is sort of she's referencing one of Plantinga's arguments, and he's making this complicated argument about how excellent a world could be and how you might measure it, and he's using different letters to stand for different levels in the hierarchy. And that part's not important, but
the trouble with this emphasis is that it deflects one's attention, distracts one's attention to the global, away from the way the evils affect persons. And the real problem of evil, it seems to me, in religion and in human life, is not about, oh, is this a good world or not? But it's about how tough it is on the people. And so what one wants to know is,
okay. Now this is a move from feminist theology, so and is which gets going in the sort of late 70s. There's this sort of feminist thinking's really been introduced into theology as a new school, and feminist thought in philosophy also puts this strong emphasis on human relationships. So that's where she's coming from there.
not whether God is an excellent world maker. The Bible says God is an excellent world maker, but whether God is good to the people, because for all we know, evils in the amounts and of the kinds and with the distributions we find in this world are compatible with this being the best of all possible worlds. But that doesn't answer our question of whether God cares about the people, whether God is good to the folks, as we say. So that would be the first problem that I see in many analytic treatments of the problem of evil. The second is the emphasis on divine justification. Now, this is etymologically natural enough because theodicy is about justifying the ways of God to human beings. That's what the word means etymologically. And so people have asked the question whether God is morally justified in making a world in which people suffer as they do. And then they focus on whether God has lived up to God's moral obligations. And then they try to formulate what God's moral obligations might be. And often enough, these are the way this problem is formulated is in terms of consequentialist kinds of reasoning. That is to say, God could be good in allowing evil only if the evils that God permits or causes are evils which are necessary to some greater good or necessary to avoid some as bad or worse evil. And this makes one focus on, once again, on the consequences and whether God could use evils as a means to some end or other. Whereas what one is interested in religiously in the problem of evil is not whether God is within God's rights in permitting all these evils. For all we know, I mean, I myself follow the medievals and don't think that God has any obligations to creatures. But what I want to know when I'm working on the problem of evil is whether God cares about the people, whether God is for us, and as Luther would say, or against us. And God may have a right not to be for us, but what one really wants to know in relating to God is God for us or not? And how can God be for us given how bad many people suffer? And the third thing that I think is really gone amiss in analytic treatments of the problem of evil is the tendency to ignore the very worst evils. I call these evils horrendous evils, but what I mean by that is evils that prima facie ruin a person's life, evils that are so bad that it is prima facie impossible for a person's life to have positive meaning given their participation in them. And it would seem that, I mean, if you focus on the global, then you aren't looking at how really bad things, the fact that somebody's life has been ruined, that will just be a little bilious green speck in the Impressionist painting, right? But if you're focused on, does God care about the people that God has made? Is God for the people that God has made? Then focusing on these evils makes the issue urgent and makes a lot of the answers about, well, God was within God's rights because of this or that or the other thing, makes those things not so relevant to what I consider the real issues.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure what she's trying to get at there. I mean,
So did I miss it? Did she present her view? She is pointing out what's the analytic view and so on, but what's her answer?
right, yeah, so we're not getting as much of that.
Wow.
This, unfortunately. So, and yeah, and pinning her down I have found is difficult. I was trying to pin her down and didn't have much luck. So yeah, which also fits with that postmodern thing. They're just hard to pin down on purpose. Anyway, thought it was just good to give you one more perspective there, since I was able to find it, and also nice to bring in a woman's voice since we're mostly these guys. So, okay, that I guess brings us back to the sort of big review, and there I'm not sure what more I should say, but certainly if there's any questions or issues you want to talk about. I am curious, Renata, you were the one I think early on was the most skeptical of the process view about like, or was it Diane? Anyway, one of you was skeptical about why am I interested in a God who doesn't have the power that we think God usually has. And I was wondering, now that we've gone through class, has anything changed? Do you remember one of you mentioning which one that was? Okay, anyway.
I just have a question regarding just the last video that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
So this speaker was bringing up, what matters is how is this playing out with the individual? We can't just always look at. She criticizes that about the process view, the big picture, and in that sense, it's not so important, when there is an evil thing because it fits into the overall and it develops. So with maybe you having a better sense for the people who are in the field working with the individuals, is this problem of evil even something that's foremost in their discussion or in pastoral training and seminaries and so on? To what degree is this theodicy part of that? are people all over the place in their, we heard Kushner,
Mhm.
Harold Kushner. He was the closest to some kind of, how do I deal with the person who is suffering right now, the individual? To what degree is that part of today's modern theological, pastoral training?
It's huge. We know from sociological research that the problem of evil is the most common reason people will give for why they left their religion.
Wow.
So for clergy, that's an incredible challenge. That they know that they're going to get asked these questions, and they know that if they answer them wrong, the person they're talking to is going to walk away.
Oh,
And so in their training, in a good program, ministers getting a master's in divinity will have a significant course load in pastoral theology, just so that they can practice thinking about and then talking about these kinds of problems. So from that, with that perspective in mind, what she's saying is really important, at least in terms of describing how the world's working, because it really is true that as academic theology wrestles with the big question, the way that that's phrased in the book, that often is not helpful pastorally to the individual who's lost a loved one suddenly for some tragedy or something. That because for the important moments, the really important moments, that's what matters. Is you're talking to one person about one problem in the world, and what are they going to do with this experience they've had in the world. So that's very true in terms of how religion is acting in the world and how people respond and what people need. That's a very, very important point. But the flip side of it is that the answer you're giving them is generally one that has to have some sort of universal application. That you're not going to have an idiosyncratic answer to the problem of evil to one person's experience of it. It's going to be part of a global answer to the problem. How you talk about it, like Kushner's pointing out, is very, very important. And there's usually a lot more sitting and listening than there is talking for that to really work on a pastoral level. But conceptually, it has to be universally coherent. So I see what she's saying in pointing that problem out, but I'm not sure what she intends us to learn from her pointing out the problem if she's challenging the whole sense of coming up with universal answers, because they both seem important. From what that's not my expertise. This is from what I understand of this.
But she doesn't come up with any, sorry, I didn't put up my hand. But she doesn't put up with anything like the personal responsibility we have for what we become and what we are. What makes us more humane?
Well,
No, I think it's more that that if you have sort of a relatively coherent sense of that kind of thing, those are not the moral problems that really disturb people. It's the things that disturb them are things that seem inexplicable and hard to pin down. I mean, certainly like a mass murder would be easy to pin down on who's responsible, but the problem's going to haunt people more when it's like cancer. And so you don't know, there's nothing to, or if there's nothing to point at, or if it's something very vague to point at. And so like my mother left the Mormon church when she was in college because her little brother developed a brain tumor and died. And the reason he developed a brain tumor is because they lived in southern Utah during the time the government was blowing shit up in Nevada, and they got poisoned by radiation from those nuclear tests. So there is something to point at. It was the nuclear test that caused the cancer ultimately, that killed him. But that in and of itself is not religiously helpful. And certainly to my mother was not religiously helpful. So
it seems to me that they default to the position, well, we can't know God's will. God is so great and wonderful, and he has a reason or a purpose, and we just can't know it. Now, that's pretty unsatisfactory, but I think that's what a lot of people get.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's gonna be much more common though in the conservative side than the liberal side. Which like with Davis. So Davis is more conservative, so you get that, well, I don't, it's really a mystery kind of a thing. Yeah, liberal religion doesn't want to treat God so mysteriously, though. So it's, which also, and which you can do with an appeal to science a little better, you know, sort of like when my uncle died because of radiation from
Right.
nuclear tests. So there is an evil to identify, but it's a kind of vague human evil. It's not it's not a specific thing. So anyway, so the more you can invoke science, the more you sort of diffuse things a little bit, and you end up with God playing less and less of an immediate role. Conceptually, there's still the same point that if God's omnipotently powerful, then whatever happens because God allowed it to happen. So the conservatives, anytime you're invoking that infinite power, which is more likely with conservative religion, you're going to have some stronger reply to it, because you don't have the vagaries of well, science just does these things, you know, or earthquakes just happen.
Does anybody address the concept that we as human beings, in the way we developed in our minds, we have a need to create a God concept? Way back when the sun was God and it came up every day and it set and whatever, that all through, it seems that all different societies have needed to create for themselves some concept of God. And maybe there's no big, powerful God that really did this, but it's all in our heads. Do psychologists?
There is in fact a scientific account of this. And oddly enough, it's not even that complicated, but it's evolutionary.
Right.
As the story goes, the first mammals running around the planet were little rodents, like the size of a shrew or a small mouse. And if you think about rodents, they're jittery, and the jittery is an appropriate evolutionary response. If there is some sort of scratchy noise and rodent hears it, it's going to run away. And what's happened is that it has assumed that the noise was caused by something that might want to eat it, and therefore running away is good. Now, the curious feature of evolution is that it actually reinforces that cognitive pattern even when mammals become predators. It just reverses the response. So a fox, when it hears a scratchy noise, it orients towards the scratchy noise, thinking that might be something for me to eat. So in both cases, evolution is reinforcing a pattern in mammalian brains to assume that things happen because of some sort of agency. That if you hear a noise and you can't see what caused it, you're going to assume someone caused it. Which is why we get so freaked out in the middle of the night when there's a storm and there's a branch being blown against your window. And even if you know what's causing the noise, the fact that there's a storm and it's dark out, you're still going to get freaked out. This is also why kids are afraid of monsters under their beds. And in psychology, they call it hyper-agency detection. And so we are predisposed to assume things have causes. And so when you take that into the world, into a complex reality with human beings running around trying to explain why is there thunder, hyper-agency detector will tell you, oh, it has to be something with power to do it. But if it's lightning, then that thing must be more powerful than me. If it's making a scratchy noise, well, that's an easy small scale power, and I can understand that as something I want to go chase after to eat. But that's actually the psychological answer to your question. It's called hyper-agency detection.
Right, and when you can't find a reason for it, there must be a God.
There you go. Because something had to want it to happen. Something made it happen. So it had to, yeah. Now, in the evolution of religion in human cultures, that starts with animism and then just gets more complicated. So you build
Right.
from small scale causal agents in the form of many, many spirits to fewer and fewer of them to ultimately with monotheism, you have one. So that is the natural evolution of human religious thought.
But the sad thing about it all, Richard, is that all this thinking, all these religions have brought nothing but pain to people.
Well,
I mean, when you look at the world now, what are we doing? So,
well,
you know,
it's
what's so great about all these religions?
well, I think, see, I mean, where I would push back on that is that I think, and this is kind of a philosophical point, is that religions are not really things like that. So, and people do horrible things and they will rationalize it in various ways. And sometimes those rationalizations will involve religion. But is religion the cause, or is it just people just use different ideas to rationalize what they do?
Well, what is the purpose of your life?
Well, that gets wrapped into that religious conversation, yes, and indeed, people really ought to be more ethical. No, and the reason the one thing to keep in mind too, in a broader scale, is the religions that we know today that exist in the world, and you all may have heard me mention this in another class. They're all historical products, that is, you can point to when they arise in history, and and all of them are relatively new in that they go back maybe 4,000, 5,000 years. 4,000 with Judaism, 5,000 with some of the Chinese religions. They all represent cultural attempts to challenge an earlier hierarchical organization of society, with the exception of Hinduism, interestingly enough. So you think about Judaism comes along as an egalitarian challenge to Canaanite religion.
Mhm.
Christianity arises as a kind of populist challenge to the ossification of the hierarchy that existed inside Judaism. Buddhism arises as an egalitarian challenge to the caste system in Hinduism, as does Jainism, and then there are a couple of smaller religions that have come up inside India that are also challenging Hinduism. In China, the ancient Chinese religions arose to challenge older Chinese religions that were much more hierarchical. Now, and they still can seem like Confucianism can seem very hierarchical, but when you look at Confucianism, what it's actually done is it's imposed limits on the power structure of society as well as on the masses. So all of those existing world religions today, with the exception of Hinduism, they all came about as cultural challenges to something that was more oppressive and abusive before it. And what's curious about Hinduism is it is the abusive, oppressive thing that those religions were rejecting, but it's managed to renew itself and change and adapt so that it's still managed to survive all those challenges, where the other religions that were being challenged by our now current world religions all did get overthrown and went away. So there is historically a story in which the religions we know today all had very important parts to play in trying to make the world a little bit more egalitarian. They get taken over, they get hijacked in a lot of ways by cultures that maintain hierarchies, but their origin stories are all about some sort of challenge to a hierarchy and trying to make the world more egalitarian. And so it's interesting. So religion is not one thing. I mean, it's because it's the anthropologically, they just say religion is the depth dimension of culture. So it's all at some level just culture, which means it's all just humans doing what humans do because we're cultural creatures.
Well, it's political too.
Yeah.
Who's got the power?
Mm-hmm. How are we organizing that power? Mm-hmm.
Yes. So I don't know. I think it makes me more of a humanist than I ever have been. I think I would take responsibility for whatever I've done and what I should be doing.
Right, and that, yeah, and so that kind of thinking arises because the world sees those existing religions themselves also ossifying into power structures. You know, you get the out of the Catholic Church and that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's certainly understandable. Renata?
I want to bring it back to the impact that this class has been having on me in terms of the different approaches. And I've been interested to think about. I don't identify as a Christian, but you know, the story of Christ's death on the cross. When I was a kid, you know, the understanding we had, well, he died for our sins, and it was almost like he took punishment for whatever human beings or Adam and Eve had caused for us. But when you think, I think what is a more modern understanding might be, or a less literal understanding might be, that here is God, Christ is God, you know, in the Trinity. And so it's a form of God limiting himself to come, to enter the realm of time and cause and so on. And so God in the form of Christ experiences suffering and is not relieved from suffering, even when he says, why is this happening? And can this, you know, whatever he did that on the last day or so. So the story goes, he dies nevertheless. And what does this say? Is this, in light of these theorists, you know, a sign that how is this looked at? Can this be looked at in these kinds of explanations of suffering? That this is God himself, in sexist language, participating in suffering, that our existence is by necessity involving evil and suffering. In this light, I wanted to ask you, would you be able to associate the different branches that we've heard about with particular traditional religions? Like the traditionalists, there's reference to Judaism. Where is Protestantism and Catholicism in terms of these people that we read about? Is one form of philosophy more embraced by a particular, let's say, Christian tradition? Or do you find that, you know, it's just like a smorgasbord, you look at what appeals to you the most?
Yeah, I think the real world is going to be more smorgasbord. The people that we're reading were all Protestants. Curiously enough, that's not by any intention on their part. It's just the accident of who they knew, because it's all people they knew, you know, in the Southern California area. But the big ideas that happen in theology get translated into all of those different kind of religious constructions. So process, there are versions of process that show up in Protestant thought, which you're seeing directly. There are versions that show up in Catholic thought, because they're Catholics who are members of the Center for Process Studies, and process gets taught in Catholic seminaries. It's made its way into Jewish thought, you know, so have Kushner's version of it. There are certainly imams now who are learning about that kind of thing, but that's true with conservative ideas as well as liberal ideas in religion, that they can show up in all of them. And
well, you don't have an officially sanctioned way to look at it in the Protestant seminary versus the Catholic, or that you have a main line.
Yeah, it's much fuzzier than it might seem like it should be or could be. And it really is fuzzier. I mean, the Catholic Church has an official theologian, and that's Aquinas. And so in some sense, what's officially Catholic theology is Aquinas's
Okay,
Summa Theologica. But when you talk to Catholic theologians, there are going to be plenty of them who are not as interested in Aquinas, and part of that is going to be because Aquinas comes at it too much from the perspective of Aristotle and not enough from the perspective of Plato. And much more of theology has been circulating around more of Plato's thinking. And so there's going to be people who they know Aristotle, they'll respect Aquinas, they'll respect Aquinas, but they're Platonists, and so they don't agree with him. And that's going to be true in all of the other religions as well. They fertilize each other. These ideas get crisscrossed, and you can definitely track the liberal versions and conservative versions, and as having some consistency to them. So in Christian thought, the conservatives are going to emphasize much more the idea about sin and Jesus as sacrificial lamb. Liberals are going to want to emphasize more where you started with Jesus and suffering, and so Jesus as the vehicle for God's empathy. So it'll show up in terms of a lot of an emphasis that they'll because they're playing the same big language game of theology, they're going to have the same kind of terms that they use. And then if it's a conservative version, they'll get emphasized in one direction, the liberal version will get emphasized in a different direction.
so are you going to teach a class on the non-Christian views of evil?
Well, religiously, these are all kind of generics. So these views do get represented in the other there, but if it's a non-religious view, then you don't have a problem. Because if there's no God in the story, you don't have a problem of evil, you just have evil.
I meant non-Christian religious.
Well, I did, Janet, I am taking up a suggestion that you were one of the people to make. Next term, I will be teaching my first book, my dissertation. So this is actually a theory of religion. So it's generic in that it's not about any one particular religion, and I'll make examples from different religions as I go through it. But as a theoretical work, it's about religion generically. How is religion generically functioning? Let's see, Janet actually had a hand up first.
Yeah, so great. I'm glad you're going to do that, because I fear that and because of how we have evolved and how the other class you taught, how God and our concept of God has evolved, that we use the word religion and theism equally.
Interchangeable.
And I don't see that much.
Right.
In reality. And so I think to say, well, religion has done nothing, Helena, is really
I don't.
misses the point for a lot of other things that we get from religion, regardless of a God. So if that, and that is what a lot of humanist religions are, in fact, about, but they're not rejecting religion, they're rejecting God. And so if you get at that in your class, your next class, Richard, I think that's to me is the heart of the matter. It's not that religion has done nothing, it's that this concept of God is throwing everybody off.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a really cool way to talk about this problem.
Well,
Right.
I don't want to say that religion has not done anything. It has done a lot for me in that I've learned to think for myself, and I'm responsible for what I do and what I think. And that is why I think, well, you'll be interested to know, but I'll take a class in Kabbalah next week. So it's just because I think I like to think, I like to learn, and then hopefully I'll be a better human being, or as good as I can be, and then I die easily. It's It's
Yeah.
practical. It's practical.
Amen.
Uh, Richard, so just a couple thoughts I had when we were talking about the pastoral approach and that people leave religion in general because of this problem of evil. And it seems to me that in my small perspective, and I was not brought up religiously, and anyways, people fight against nature. I think part of, oh, my child died, and or like your mother's brother died for I don't want to say natural causes, but there's something you can point to that would cause this. And in some cases, you can't point
Mhm.
to something terrible that has happened because we don't understand it yet.
Mhm.
So part of what I see religion does is an attempt to explain natural causes that we do or don't understand yet.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then I understand there's some value in religion for the individual. And of course, I'm seeing the evangelicals and the meanness and the hatred that's coming forth from them. And of course, we can't ignore the Inquisition that caused so much evil in the world. And that was because of a specific religion and their dogma. It
Mhm.
wasn't the individual interpretation of the religion. And to me, from what I see in my little world, is that an individual, or I'll say the brain, that can believe some of the religious dogma, to me, is dangerous to my world.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I did, yeah.
You know,
Okay.
so again, I know the harm that religion has done, albeit has been mostly historical, and we don't see as much, I'm going to say corporate religion do extracting harm. Although you could say that the Catholic Church that's against abortion is hurting women terribly.
Right.
So that's an example of anyways, to me, the biggest harm is people that can believe in mythology like this in this day and age is hurting my world.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
preventing progress in a way. We could be so much further ahead if
Yeah,
we didn't.
that's sort of precisely my motivation in trying to write the next book I'm trying to write, is to argue that religion can make great progress by giving up this old dogma about metaphysics and just look at the things it really should be doing about terms of encouraging community and human development. But
Yes.
in terms of what you were, the broader question you started with, animism is the attempt of people to understand the world. There's one way of understanding intelligence is simply pattern recognition. The more intelligent a creature is, the better it is at recognizing patterns. And we get to a certain point where we might be too good for our own benefit at seeing patterns, because we'll see patterns that aren't really there.
That aren't there.
And so the animist is really just seeing patterns and labeling them. And the patterns are mysterious, and therefore the label they put on it is a mysterious kind of label called spirit. But that is what they're doing. They're trying to understand the world. They're just using the patterns they see.
And so the minister too is trying to comfort an individual through a process that's natural, because somehow we've developed the idea that death is bad.
Yeah.
I mean, in my mother's world, who was 40 when she had me. So, she was born at the turn of the century. People died at home in the living, and you did it in the living room. And it wasn't, I mean, of course you mourn the loss, but it wasn't a universal badness. It was something natural that happened to people.
Yeah, they were closer to those things. Yeah.
Today we think God is punishing us because somebody dies. Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Well, and especially if they die young.
Well, that's
It
true.
doesn't get as invoked with older people, but
That's
yeah,
true.
and I actually just finished a very disturbing book. This guy who's is a political science professor, and he's studying to become a psychoanalyst. And he wrote, and he wrote this book is called The Twilight of the Self. And what he's arguing is that because we have to be taught to submit to the hierarchical structures of a capitalist society,
Mhm.
and corporate heads, that we're not having the same kinds of more egalitarian conflicts that would have been characteristic of human life historically. And because we don't have the challenge of those kinds of conflicts, we don't learn critical thinking the way that people historically learned critical thinking. And it's an interesting argument. And one of the things that people often sort of push back, right, is they think, well, but feudalism was a very hierarchical system, and people had to learn to fit themselves into that system. But what more modern theorists are noticing is that the average serf didn't really have that much interaction with the lord who was over them. And they might never even have an interaction, because there's going to be some sort of intermediary. But even that isn't very often. Most of the time, the serf is just left to do whatever they do. They're expected to give the lord, a certain percentage, whatever that is. And if they don't, there's hell to pay. But as long as they're just going along, doing their work, and they keep giving the lord the percentage, they live their own kind of life. But more importantly, everyone they usually interact with is also a peasant. And so their interactions are interactions among relative equals. And those kinds of conflicts are more psychologically healthy. So it's in that interaction, you learn to think critically, because it's okay for you to push back, because the authority doesn't just crush you immediately. If you're really dealing with equals, that conflict has to be mediated in a more rational kind of way. So he seems to suggest then that this is why we have the problem we have today about people falling for all kinds of weird stuff, these weird ideas, or falling for Trump's big lie. It's because we're not being raised the way we used to, and so human beings in general are not learning the critical thinking skills that we used to, and so we're falling for even more transparently weird and stupid stuff than we used to. Because at least the stuff we now think of as weird and transparently stupid was complicated enough it didn't seem that way to them at the time. You had to do a sophisticated analysis to figure out there was something wrong with that kind of thinking. Yeah, Renata.
But isn't there also the question? I mean, I think that there's something to this, the complexity of our structure within capitalism or other forms. It's not bringing out the best of us. If there's something that we can call the best, and I think that's the other question. There's some people who are claiming that there's certain things that if you take the individual, make you as the individual, feel best, so to speak, in life, and the idea of empathy, compassion, simplicity, whatever, that there are certain common things, whether they're used in therapy or in religious approaches, really across the board, seem pretty similar in assuming there is something that's kind of brings out the best, or the goodness in people. Of course, that's the whole thing, whether we are evolutionary doing better if we cooperate, or if we don't tolerate suffering of our, dear and near fellow human being, or if it's really a value that's built in. So I think that's the other question. Are we just neutral creations, or are religious approaches really trying to get us to some core values in the positive side, aside from whether we get rewarded later on in heaven, but it's good for us, so to speak. It enhances our lives in the sense that we die, we are more peaceful, we are more satisfied, we are better. It's all relative, but some people are saying that these kinds of traits, human traits, are generally pointed out as the signs of what all religions try to further and support.
Well, there is the idea of the golden rule, that is as an ethical principle is common to the world religions today. And I think that's, like I was saying before, I think that's part of the fact they all arose as challenges to hierarchies. So they all adopted some version of everyone needs to be nice to each other. But the ethical roots are, there's some reason to believe that they're primate based, that our emotional lives are mammalian, but our ethical systems seem to come out of primate systems. So there's some basic primate responses to the world that are manifest in how humans behave. Like, and I talk about this, we'll talk about this in next term because it comes up in my book, but it's a guy named Frans de Waal directs the Yerkes Primate Institute in Atlanta, and has written a number of books on this theme. But one of the studies that they did there that's really kind of curious, they took some capuchin monkeys, little monkeys from South America, and they put them in cages that are next to each other, and they teach them a little trick that they're supposed to do. And when they do it appropriately, they get rewarded. So for the experiment, they do the little trick and they give one monkey a slice of cucumber, and then they give the other a grape. Well, in the capuchin world, the cucumber is just food and the grape is candy. The one that gets the grape, the one that gets the cucumber, often will throw it at the experimenter and pound on the cage because it's recognizing that something's wrong. Why did that one get a grape and I didn't? So it seems there's an egalitarian kind of awareness that seems to be part of primates, and that we have inherited that as a sort of fundamental way of thinking about ethics, is that we do have a kind of fundamental egalitarian sense, but it's really deeply there in our evolution.
A sense of fairness, right?
As egalitarian fairness, yeah.
Oh, right.
Well,
Yeah.
This is very interesting because I moved out of the gated communities in order to live here in First Hill. And I happened to look on dumpsters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of the dumpsters diaries that someone told me I ought to do.
Oh, that's a good
All
way to put it.
These people in that dumpster, sometimes they sit in there, they hang in there. It's a bloody mess that they make, but they look for whatever is there. And, I want this because what can I do about it? That is an ethical thing. What can I do about it? That's part of my life, is that I'm also responsible for that. I could have lived in a nice apartment and not see it, but something in me wants to know what's going on there. And I'm not sure why that is or why I am that way. And yet I don't know what to do. And when I asked him, I went once to the church here and I told him about it. And he said, well, it's not my jurisdiction. It's not something he could be doing. So I don't know that I know, where are the answers? I find it in Bernie, of course, but if we all follow Bernie, we'd have a better world. There's
the idea social problems need social solutions, but it's also, and when they're big problems, it really is frustrating for us because you have that sense there's something wrong, something ought to respond to this problem, but it's beyond me personally to respond. So what do I do?
Yeah, and I can't even bring them bread because then people above me are going to be very upset maybe that I do this because we'll get more of them. Who cares, really?
Really
Should
makes the
not
problem
be doing
complicated.
this.
Yeah.
It's a very conflicting thing for me to look at every day, and I think
Yeah.
about it.
And I think that it's partly it's a problem with scale that, you know, we evolved to live in small groups, you know, like 100 or 200. We didn't evolve to live in societies with 1 million people. So we're not that good at navigating it yet. Janet, did you have a hand up?
No, I just want to thank you though for this class again and
It's a good
hope
class.
everybody has a good holiday.
Oh, yeah, it's
Yes.
fine.
We are out of time. So yeah, thank you all very much. I certainly have a wonderful.
Thank you.
teaching and a
Thank
course
you.
of
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're quite
Bye.
welcome. Take care. I'll see you later. All right, let's stop.